Well, so far so good with the cigar. I'm enjoying it. It's burning nice and even. Just waiting for that ash to fall off. Hopefully it doesn't fall off on me. And I'm enjoying the cigar. Would I say that this cigar is worth $130 to $150? No. I've had Davidoffs and other cigars that are just as good a quality at a fraction of the price. Have a quick sip of this again. And I'm not gonna make up, all these different flavor notes that I've seen some people say, oh man, it tastes like cake, bread, pudding, you name it. I don't know how a cigar could taste like that, but I do get, like I said, sort of that graham cracker dryness to it, along with a little bit of cocoa and some light leather notes. That's really about all. It hasn't changed in flavor whatsoever since I started smoking the cigar. But overall, I mean, as of right now, it's a good cigar. I'm really enjoying it. The draw is actually nice, opened up a little bit more. But I want to continue talking about His Excellency, George Washington. Like I said, he's now into retirement. And George Washington is a creature of habit. He, like many people, did the same thing over and over, day in and day out. He would get up before sunrise, well before sunrise. He would read his Bible and pray for several hours. Then he would get dressed. He would sort of get briefed on some of the daily news or things that were going on, the information that had been delivered to him. And then he would have a hearty breakfast of oatcakes, drenched in butter and honey, according to his adopted granddaughter, Nellie Custis Washington. But Washington would travel around on all of his farms on a daily basis. And on December 12th, Washington checked the mercury. He was a fanatic about the weather too. He checked the weather every day and would document it in his journals. But he checked the weather that day and it was 1 degree above freezing. And around 10 a.m., Washington mounted his horse and he got on and took off and basically would go around to the farm, the various farm sites, helping, instructing, doing different things on the farms. But it was a very awkward day weather-wise. When Washington actually left, it was sleeting and it was a little bit of snow mixed in with that. And then by about early afternoon, it had transitioned over into freezing rain. And a little bit before 3 o'clock, Washington gets back to the mansion, Mount Vernon, and he is just covered in ice, sleet, snow. His hat, he wore a hat actually just like this. This is a replica of Washington's tricorn. This is a very expensive hat. It's beaver felt. It's got the little ribbon on the side here, and it's tricorn. They would wear it cocked over to one side because when they were shooting their rifle. But this is the hat that Washington wore, and his hair was long, and it was ponytailed in the back, and it was covered in ice. He was just soaked. And Tobias Lear, Washington's secretary, insisted that Washington go change before he eat dinner with his guests. Well, Washington was probably one of the most prompt people you'd ever meet in your life. And he absolutely said, no way, I'm not going to change. I've got dry garment on underneath. I'm just gonna take my overcoat off and go have dinner with the guests because dinner was already on the table and it was waiting. So he has dinner, and by the next morning, about 3 inches of snow had fallen onto the ground. And Washington wouldn't be checking the farms this day. Too much snow, a lot of ice, and he had a sore throat. Washington had started to get sort of an irritation in his throat. So one of the last things he did during the day was he did this on a pretty much regular basis, but he'd step out to the back of the piazza that overlooked the Potomac River. It slopes down beautifully. I'm sure he was just looking at all the fresh fallen snow and the river just sort of moving by. It would have been an absolutely beautiful sight, particularly in the 18th century when it wasn't impeded with, other things going on in the background. But that would be the last time that Washington would go out onto the piazza. Later that evening, after dinner, the Washingtons, Martha and George, along with Tobias Lear, they retired into the parlor. And this is where Washington would read out loud. A lot of times the grandchildren would be there, other family members and guests, and they would read the newspaper or articles and laugh and talk. And as Washington was reading, his voice became very hoarse, and it progressively got worse to the point where he just stopped reading altogether. And right before bed, Lear had suggested that Washington take something for his sore throat to help alleviate it, whatever he could do to just help the general out. Washington was very hard-headed. He insisted, no, I'm all good. Leave me alone. It's a cold. It's going to go away. I'll be just fine. Well, by about sunrise on December 14th, Tobias Lear was summoned to Washington's bedchamber in an emergency. When Lear came into the room, he was sort of thrown back at first because of Washington's state. He said that he found the general looking and breathing with difficulty. He couldn't talk. He could hardly muster any words. And it was a bad sight for Lear. It did not look good for Washington. And around 2 or 3 a.m., going back a little bit in time, around 2 or 3 a.m. that morning, Washington had woke Martha up, and he couldn't breathe. He could barely talk. Martha was scared. She wanted to order a doctor immediately, but Washington said, no way, you're not getting out of bed. It's too cold. They didn't have furnaces, so if the fireplace wasn't stoked, the room was barely above freezing. You just snuggled in under the covers. Washington didn't want Martha to be disturbed, so they went back to bed. But now you've got Tobias Lear is standing here right now, and they need to do something. They've got to act quick. So the first thing they do is they want to summon somebody that can perform bloodletting, where they would extract blood from the individual in hopes that that would alleviate the virus or the toxin that was in the body. Well, the closest individual that could do that was George Rawlins. And he was not a physician, but by the time Rawlins arrives, he is a nervous wreck when he's standing at the edge of Washington's bed, and the general can barely breathe. And they're like, we need to act immediately. So immediately he makes an incision in Washington's arm, and he starts to let a little bit of the blood out. It wasn't moving quickly enough, and Washington, in a fit of rage, is like, more. And they got the blood flowing. But at about the same time when they were extracting the blood from Washington, they wanted to make him a drink to try and help soothe or alleviate some of the problem with his throat. So they put together a little mix of butter, vinegar, and molasses. And when they began to pour it down his throat, he just spewed it all up. He couldn't take it in whatsoever. He started choking. They almost thought he was going to die when that happened. And by this time, Rawlins had pulled out probably about a pint of his blood, maybe a little bit more. And Martha is getting really scared at this point. She is not liking what she is seeing, and she really doesn't like to see blood coming from the general, at least this much blood. And finally she shouts to them, stop taking his blood. And they do. About that time, Dr. James Craik arrives. He is a physician. He is a lifelong friend of Washington's that the two of them met at the Battle of the Monongahela decades before, and they had been friends ever since. And one of the first things that Craik does is he administers another bloodletting. No progress is made again. They've drawn a whole bunch more blood. He's still not in good shape. Well, then Dr. Craik wants to use Spanish flies as an agent of creating blisters on the back of Washington's throat. So he applies them. That doesn't work. He then says, okay, we're going to put together another concoction of molasses and vinegar. They try and give it to Washington, and he just about chokes to death again. It must have been an absolute horrendous sight. This time, a bunch of phlegm came up with it, and Craik instructs Washington to cough more. Get this phlegm, get this out of your system as quickly as possible. We need to get you back. Washington didn't have the strength to even do that at that point in time. So they're really starting to run into problems. Now, about this time, 2 other doctors arrived. Dr. Elisha Dick from Alexandria and Dr. Gustavus Richard Brown arrives from Maryland, just across the river. And what's the first thing they do? They administer another bloodletting. This time, it's getting bad because the blood is coagulating. There's not a whole lot left. It's really thick and it's hardly flowing. And they couldn't really think of what else to do at this point, so they're starting to panic. Now, I'm gonna get down a little bit further on the cigar. When I come back, we're gonna finish up with what happened to George Washington after they did this final bloodletting. Well, that ash finally came off the cigar. It actually went out on me and I had to relight it, but the draw is improving a little bit. It's slow but steady. Just real quick, I'm not typically an individual that smokes it all the way down to the nub. It just gets too hot. I think the tobacco starts to taste a little bad. Usually I'll take my cigar right up to maybe about midway through this second band there. And that's usually about enough for me. If it's not a very good cigar, it'll get cut short well before then. And this one is, right now, like I said, it's a good cigar. But again, it's not something that I would probably purchase again for that amount of money. So with that being said, let's continue with George Washington and the very sad state that he is in. Man, if only this guy would have had access to modern medicine, things would have been a lot different. He would have survived almost certainly. But as the doctors are together, the 3 of them, they're really running out of options. At this point, they can't even agree what Washington has or what is exactly wrong with him. Finally, they come to a general consensus that he has a severe inflammation of the throat, possibly quinsy or some type of bacteria infection. Now, back then, they didn't even know what germs were. So they didn't make any type of connection that it could have been some type of infection in the throat that was causing that. And it's probably what it was. But the last chance that they had to save His Excellency, George Washington, would have been to perform something that we do in modern medicine. It's known as a tracheotomy. A tracheotomy is basically an incision that would go right above the collarbone right here, and it would create an opening where you could breathe through that, and it is below whatever is blocking you from breathing properly. And it was actually proposed by Elisha, but it was ultimately vetoed by the other 2 doctors who said, no, this is too dangerous. We don't want to do that. We don't want to take that chance. So would it have worked? We'll never know. But man, it would have been great if they would at least given it a shot to save the general. But what did they opt for? A 4th bloodletting. Yes, a 4th bloodletting. And, Elisha Dick, the youngest doctor in the room at this time, he says, look, you can't do this. Look at the general. He is in a very, very bad state right now. He needs all the energy and all the fluids he can that he can muster up to just survive through this. But they did go ahead and, like I said, they vetoed him on this. And they went ahead and commenced with another bloodletting. By this point in time, they had withdrawn 80 ounces of Washington's blood. That's over almost 2.5 liters and 40% of the blood in your body. It was gone. And at this point in time, Washington has virtually no life left in him. The only thing that's really happening is his body is just sort of laying there limp, gasping for air. And somehow, Washington musters enough strength to speak, and he says, I feel myself going. He's gonna die. Washington has recognized his mortality, that it is his time to go. And he looks at the doctors and he says, look, I thank you for your attentions, but I pray that you take no more trouble about me. "Let me go off quietly," Washington says to the doctors. And the two oldest doctors leave, or excuse me, the youngest doctor and Brown leave. But Washington is sitting there with Dr. James Craik, his good friend. And Dr. James Craik is just in tears, crying as he watches the general suffer like this. It must have been a horrendous sight. And Washington rolls his head over to the side a little bit, and he says, "Doctor, I die hard. But guess what? I'm not afraid to go." Washington was not afraid of death. And now the only people left in the room were Caroline, the servant, Christopher Shields, the butler, Martha, and Dr. James Craik. And all they could do is watch Washington's body shake and convulse as it gasped and tried to get every single ounce of air that it could. And, it was just, I couldn't imagine what the sight would have been like. But somehow, again, Washington musters enough strength to say, "After I die, wait 2 days before you put my body in the grave, because I want to make sure I'm dead." Now, I'm paraphrasing a little bit of what he said. I'm not quoting him verbatim, but that is in essence what Washington said. He was afraid that they would bury him too soon and he would wake up alive in the tomb, and it would just be a horrific scene. So they honored what he said. Washington's last words were, "'Tis well." And he slowly slipped away. His pulse got soft, just a very slow pulse, and all of his muscles relaxed, and he just passed. One of the great mysteries is what killed George Washington. What was the disease? Nobody actually knows, and will never actually know. This is a hotly debated topic. But per his request, they did wait 2 days to bury him. They put him in his family vault with his other family members, right alongside the Potomac before the new one was built, about 50 years later, I think, roughly. But His Excellency George Washington, his public service went beyond anyone else. He exceeded everyone's expectations. Washington laid the groundwork for future presidents, for future generations, on how to lead, on how to be selfless, how to be courageous, how to be a trendsetter. These were all characteristics of George Washington. Quote from Thomas Paine that I think really resonated as an attribute or something that was characteristic of Washington. He met all these, exceeded them, but he actually read this before they were going to cross the Delaware. And I want to read this real quick. Most people will recognize the first couple sentences, but Paine says this: "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is in dearness only that gives everything its value, and that was definitely what Washington was. He encompassed all of those. So, I hope you enjoyed this installment of History Up in Smoke. I know I did, and I'll see you next time. Until then, take care.